say that we haven't had a service quite like this before. And yet it is unique, and I'm grateful to Robin Page and the officers of the Countryside Restoration Trust for their initiative in suggesting that we had it here. Indeed, it was just a great joy to say without any hesitation, when Robin asked me whether we could have the service here, to say yes. I'm just sorry that it's a little bit uncomfortable in terms of A, the heat. Well, I can't do anything about that. You must thank the good Lord, or say something else if you're a bit bothered. And also for folk who actually are outside, or whom I do hope that at least if this isn't really a very visual service, but certainly we want to hear. And I do hope that the technology that we provided will enable everybody to hear. A special welcome to our guests, to Gordon Benningfield and Brian Heap, who will be sharing in a little dialogue with myself later on, and particularly to Sir Lawrence van der Post, who's come as our main speaker. We're delighted to have him here with us.
And thank you for the invitation to be here today. Although possibly not known to in recent years, we used to live in Barton and had the delight of our children growing up in the primary school, so we're not too far distant from Barton. Until recently, I've been the Director of Research at the Institute of Animal Physiology at Babraham, and also Director of Science for the Agricultural and Food Research Council, which has now become a mouthful, Biotechnology and Biological Sciences Research Council, one of the research councils of the UK, concerned particularly with the area of food production and of the use of biotechnology in the future.
Could I then follow on, Brian, and say to you, you know, in what way does your work then confront you with environmental issues?
Well, I think in many ways, because as we're all familiar from a community such as this, in an area of the country such as this, we are faced with the question of how does one provide food requirements globally for a population that is increasing at something of the order of doubling every 8 to 10 years, and a world population that is, by the end of this century, going to be something of the order of 7 or 8 billion. And although it may well be seen that in Europe we appear not to have food shortages, I think we need to remember that it's recently been shown that at the present time we've got something like 30 days supply in the world if there was to be a cessation of food production from today onwards. In other words, the apparent excesses that we've had in recent years is not something that gives us great hope for the future in providing for a world population. Of course, the issues that we have to confront are those that are to do with how one can produce food for a growing world population in a way that's sustainable and doesn't damage the environment, and cause irreversible change, and at the same time does provide for this growing population that we have to confront and that we have to consider in terms of the future. So in that sense, we come right up against some very pressing environmental issues. And from a Christian perspective, of course, that raises all sorts of additional questions that one has to face as a believer.
Let's leave you there for a moment and draw Gordon in. Gordon, I wonder if I could just ask you, say, that as a professional artist, what is it that draws you to the natural world and has drawn you to express that engagement with nature in art?
Well, I don't think it's just me. I think that art in this country, probably across the world, has been influenced by the natural world. And I think that's the biggest influence that art has had, maybe. Writing, sculpture, painting, music, poetry. The natural world is always there as this driving wonderland. and inspires all artists, I think. They may not constantly paint it like myself, but I can assure you I had the great privilege to meet Henry Moore, first when I was very young, 1951, and then in 59. And although his work was very abstract, large monumental pieces of sculpture, he drew all that from the natural world, from objects from the natural world, may it be trees, bones, internal, external forms, by looking, I think, at birds' nests with the eggs inside, so you've got an outside form and one inside. And then he related this to, as he called it, the reclining figure. So he was tying it into the human being as well. So I'll repeat myself and say that the natural world is the driving force and the biggest influence on art of the world.
Even though quite a number, it seems to me, as a very lay person, when it comes to matters of art appreciation, even though some of our contemporaries want to go inwards rather than outwards in their exploration for subject matter. I mean, to take a picture of their own pancreas or something like this is seen to be something of artistic merit. I mean, you would have some hesitations about that, would you?
You have questions in every profession, and in my own personal opinion, you have people that you have to carry as well, and this is my opinion. But the bulk of it, I think the general, as I say, is looking at the natural world. Because it's beyond us all. It's the wonderland that none of us can actually reach because it's far above. I mean, whatever we achieve in this world, the human being, and we don't, personally, I don't think we are doing a great good job there. In fact, as we just heard, the planet is creaking under the problems of the human being. So I think when you get really down to it and know where your heart is, you end up, a bit like when you're in a tight spot, whether you say you're a Christian, whether you say you're religious, you end up praying. And I think most people do. And I think you end up by leaning onto that fantastic world out there, which, stepping out of the profession of art and into the passion of conservation, of course, that's the one major force that you are concerned about as a naturalist and a conservationist, that you're seeing hourly this wonderful planet of ours deteriorating. And as we've just heard, this terrific pressure by the human race, which is getting bigger and bigger.
What then is you feel you are contributing to? I mean, do you see yourself in some way as a campaigner?
I hope I do. Yeah, I mean.
Can you say a little more about what you see you're campaigning for?
Well, there's only one thing that any of us are campaigning for, and that's the future of the planet. Let's say I'm talking about this country, and we're trying to save the landscape and the wildlife that depends on a I won't say wild landscape, a semi-natural landscape. But actual fact, day by day, that landscape is being destroyed by human beings, and every other form of life, unfortunately, is going way down. I mean, we're seeing, the emblem here for Countryside Restoration Trust, the skylark. Not only is it one of the things that we all love, and certainly a bird that's influenced art and poetry and music. Vaughan Williams' Lark Ascending. Lark Rise to Candleford. Many painters have produced paintings and sculptures of it. That's what we're worried about. You're seeing the common species going down. And it's because we never leave the countryside alone. It's constantly disturbed without really knowing anything about the natural world. It amazes me that after all these years of discussion, may it be on television, radio, books, we do seem to be still going down the pan a bit in that respect. When you see the tree sparrow now is in the red data book. Well, I do think that we must look, because if the tree sparrow is going down, if 24 of our 57 butterflies are endangered, we are very much in danger. We might be the last ones. But I don't think it was planned that way. We were put here to be part of the pattern, be part of the fragments and the whole aspect of the planet. But I'm afraid there's a bit of a hiccup going along. And unless we address that, I think we are heading for a very, very bleak and serious situation. So that, I think, is what all naturalists and people involved for with the likes of Countryside Restoration Trust are concerned about. And what they're saying is, look, this can be done better. You can develop food crops, but you can also have a corner here and a margin there and a brook there and a spinney and a hedgerow. You can do this.
And your attention to that kind of, particularly in the English context, within the English countryside, your attention to the detail of the countryside in your paintings, which, as it were, we could otherwise easily take for granted, is part of actually something that in your art itself, I mean, you've got something to say there.
A lot of people say, why don't you paint the devastation you talk about? Because I don't think I'm going to capture anyone's imagination or attention. It's like a television programme, the first 2 or 3 minutes is you capture them or they turn over. And I want to show the fragments of this wonderland, something that we've all known as children, and let's hope children will be able to see a few more fragments. So, oh, I do remember that. Are they still there? I'm amazed. Where do you find these things? Well, then you say, but if you're not careful, that dandelion clock will not be there to blow as you go to school and count the time. I mean, it's that aspect. I don't want to depress to a point where I say, what's the point? Because you must be positive. You must have good points to lift up the feeling that we've got to save this planet for us all. And we've got to realise there's not just the humans that depend on it, every other form of life, from plant life right the way up to mammals, birds, insects. And can't we really think that we may see the first butterfly spring? Can we think of a time when you won't hear rooks building in March? And really, can you think that artists and composers and poets will not be inspired by the sound of a skylark? It's up to us, you know.
Brian, you've been listening to that. What is in my mind is, how can we then confront this huge human problem of population and feeding the population, which you started off with Gordon's concern for the fragments of our wonderland? And it seems to me there's a tremendous, if not conflict there is a conflict in the way we manage those two poles of the environment. Can you help us?
I don't know that I can help you, but I think there are some thoughts that have come back to me as you were speaking, which are very interesting what you were saying, because I think in some respects we have to go back to Genesis, because I suspect that that's where the whole debate begins, because and to this extent the Christian church and the Judeo-Christian tradition carries a tremendous responsibility. We're all familiar with the words in Genesis 1, which speaks about the way in which God gave dominion to man over the world in which we've been placed. And of course, for centuries, and particularly during the Victorian period, that was a dominant theme. That we have the right to do what we wish with the planet because that is what God ordained initially in Genesis chapter 1. And if I may say so, and I don't know who's chosen your prayers, I think you see it reflected even today in the service that we're having here. There is this element that we have the right to use that which is best from creation. We have the best strawberry, we have the best lamb, and so on, and it's for us. And the focus is entirely on the individual, on the person. And I think the fact that this service is related to the Countryside Restoration Trust brings us to the key issue, which is actually in Genesis 2, because it's the dominion idea is counterbalanced completely by the fact that God also said, you have the responsibility to be stewards for the world in which I placed you, and to look after the garden and to till it and restore it. And the dilemma that we've had over the years is that the emphasis has been dominantly on the first component, and consequently, look what a mess we've made, and so little on the latter. And it's only in recent years, with the emphasis of people who've started to raise questions about how does one sustain the world in which we live, that there's now come into thinking a much stronger consideration of what I believe was God's initial statement for mankind, that we are not the centre of the universe. I think it's very interesting, the creation story, and I've been helped greatly by the distinguished German theologian Jürgen Moltmann in the lectures that he gave, the Gifford lectures that he gave in Edinburgh in the 80s, in which he drew attention to the fact that this focus we have so much on man is a misplaced focus, and that in fact our aim in being here is to glorify God. If we weren't here, the scriptures tell us that the heavens would glorify God, because the heavens tell and reflect, as we've been singing our hymn, the glory of God. So in that sense, I think the issue that we're considering at the moment is something that's very, very fundamental to how we relate not only to one another and the world in which we live, but our relationship to God the Creator. So in that sense, I find it important to go back to those fundamental issues, which I think we have to wrestle with and ask ourselves, to what extent are we functioning in this stewardship capacity? And for many of us, including myself, we would say we're doing it pretty badly. But it's time we better look at it much more seriously than we have in the past.
I would just like to follow that up with one quickie, and this ought to be I ought to be speaking to myself, but I'm in the just asking the question, not giving the answers. And that question is, I mean, do you think that part of that what's there in the Christian tradition in the creation story in Genesis, that we must be humble enough to be servants of the created order and glorify God, I mean, it means actually that we have to learn from the wisdom of other religions. Which, I mean, I'm sure that Sir Lawrence will probably want to pick that up with eagerness, I suspect. But I mean, this seems to me to be one of the things that the Christian Church is confronted with, as a, is to acknowledge that actually on the matters, the whole question of how humankind responds to the environment, actually the Judeo-Christian tradition hasn't actually, it's got a great deal of wisdom, but it hasn't got it all, maybe.
I think I might put it in a different way, because I feel myself that the importance is for us to learn from Christian teaching, and that we've really not grasped, as we should have done, the stewardship principle that is a God-given principle for the world in which we live and for ourselves. And that's a huge and tremendous and challenging theme. And if we can really understand that and the revelation that we see particularly in Christ and what it meant to him in terms of the compassion and his relationship with the created order, I think there is a huge amount for us to learn there. I'm not in any sense putting to one side what we can learn from others, but I do feel that we've perhaps not addressed enough
what's
the
in our own
emphasis
tradition.
of Christian tradition and Christian teaching.
Thank you. Gordon, a question to you, and we must then draw this to a close, really. It was, of course, the great poet Wordsworth who said, who urged us to step out into the light of things and let nature be our teacher. Mm-hmm. Is that, I mean, to some extent all of us do that, I'm sure, whether we have our Bibles in our pockets or not. But is that kind of illumination and teaching that we might get from simply attending to the natural order around us, is that adequate to make us the kind of stewards that we ought to be, that Ryan's been talking about?
Yeah, possibly. I think that if you just look at the natural world, there you are seeing God. I mean, you are seeing God and what he means and what he sums up. If you have time just to watch insects moving around on a summer's day, if you just look at the oceans or even the streams and see the life that lives within certain habitats, if you listen to the sound of birds in a dawn chorus, if you think of an autumn day, I mean, the whole aspect of the changing seasons, that's what it's all, that is God. I mean, we come into a wonderful church like this to bring ourselves together, and we need a focal point. But it's there, it's all going on. What worries me is it's shrinking. It's getting less and less and less. Of course we are, and we were, part of it, always meant to be. But it's everything in moderation. For some reason or other, we've seemed to have leapt so fast, particularly probably in the last 50 years or faster than any other time, in terms of changing landscape. And I think that's the serious worry. So let us bear in mind, if we are thinking of Christian teaching, let's go and look at the landscape and see if it is in the sort of good heart that God intended us and gave us the hold of it. He gave it to us to say, now see what you're going to make of that. I don't think he's happy at the moment about what we've made of it. But it's no good saying that we're at the 11th hour. I think we're at probably like the 15th hour. We've gone beyond that one. And it's up to us now, very, very rapidly, to say if we want to save the teachings of God, look at the natural world, look what he gave us, and it's up to us to try and do something about it. Because I will repeat myself, unless we do, we and the planet are totally doomed.
Well, on that note, our time is up. So, Gordon Bennyfield and Brian Heaton, thank you very much.
I was listening fascinated to the dialogue which has just taken place. And I feel that underneath it too, it says, what do we all do about this moment in which we find ourselves? We've been exhorting those of us who feel particularly concerned with environmental issues. We've got exhausted with trying to people to exhort them to do something about the environment. And I think they must be almost as tired of being exhorted as we who do the exhorting have become of it. And it clearly is not enough. I don't think that any of us really realize how much, since the Industrial Revolution began, how the mind and the spirit of man was changing, how his values were being shifted away, more and more away, to a man-made world, a man-controlled world, a world, as it were, in which nature played a very subordinate part, if a major part at all. It was just there as a sort of supply to feed this rationally controlled world of ours. And it's very clear that we're not going to do anything ever about the environment by working on the environment alone if we do not realize what an enormous revolution has to take place in the spirit of mind and man and in our lives. And there I am so deeply grateful that I can talk to you and we can be together in a church. We can be together, to quote T.S. Eliot in one of his last quartets, when he was in a state of despair, at a very bad moment in the world, in the history of Europe, when all seemed to be about to be overcome by darkness and by evil. And he was in this church at Little Gidding, and he said to himself, rebuked himself, I've not come here to exhort. I've not come here to speak or to record or to collect advice. I've come here because it's always been a place where it's valid to pray. And that we should having this little discussion, this little meeting in this place, which has been here for centuries, it's been valid to pray. It's been valid to turn to something which is beyond us. And more, this part of ourselves must not just rely, it's important to rely on two things, of course. One is the example of what we do in all our lives. The importance of the example, which is slowly being orchestrated here in the trust which Robin Page has founded and inspired. The importance of is immense of what they do. And that automatically, what we do what is true and what is valid for the spirit is also valid for nature. And so what I'm going to try and do in the next few minutes is to talk to you about how it's confirmed. Now, how if we turn to nature, the confirmation and the response comes out of nature. So what I'm really going to do is to continue the dialogue started by the skylark. You all know, I think, Robin's account, which he's given us, of that moving event which occurred when they decided to have a skylark. A skylark, the skylark which was so predominant, such a dominant element in the bird life of this country, with his strange flight and his lovely song, is one of the almost an endangered bird species in great parts of the country. In a part of Suffolk by the sea where I live, I can remember in 1936 when I went there and I walked across the marshes, I could hardly hear myself speak to the people who accompanied me because of the noise made by skylarks, shooting up and going up to the top of their flight. And I remember when I heard this in Japan, and I heard it in Korea, and I heard it in China. The skylark was a symbol. People said the same thing. In all those different cultures, they said, he's quarreling with God. He's gone up to have a dialogue with God, to ask God why he's not doing more about the world. That is a skylark. Well, here, the moment when they were in these fields, which are part of the trust, and they decided they would have, for the logo of what we are trying to do, would have an image. They have the image of the skylark. And they had not settled on this long, and were walking to a gate, which I happened to open about a year or more ago. And a skylark, at a place where it's become rare, suddenly rose and went up, and as it were, blessed, and said, yes, we are with you on behalf of the skylarks of the world. Skylarks of the world unite, and unite with man, and join in this, in what they are trying to do. And we come here on a phenomenon to which I want to draw your attention, not only in connection with what we are doing about nature, but in connection with our own lives and this time in which we're living. We are in a moment, again, to quote Eliot, because again in this place where it was always valid to pray, he knelt. And what came to him then was a new sense of history, in which he said, a people without history is not redeemed from time. Because history is a pattern of timeless moments. So history is England, and history is now. And this is this kind of nowness of history when we contemplate this phenomenon, which I want to talk out of the heart of this nowness of history, and to tell you that this phenomenon of the skylark has a name in science today. It's called synchronicity. And this synchronicity was a term which was given by one of the greatest explorers of the human world, certainly of our time, and perhaps the world has ever seen, the great psychologist Jung. He'd come to a phenomenon that he'd noticed in the human spirit, that ever when the human spirit seemed singularly on course, as it were out of nature, there came a phenomenon to confirm and say, I'm on your side. Now at that time, when he came to this, he had started what was called an analysis with one of the greatest scientists, one of the greatest physicists of our age, a man by the name of Pauli, whose name stands and whose achievements in physics stand in the dimension of Einstein, of Niels Bohr, of Heisenberg, and all the others that followed. And this phenomenon had occurred, had been brought to Jung's attention by Pauli, who'd come to him at a moment when He was bright, Pauli. He was at the top of his intellectual powers, and yet he had become lost. As he wrote and said afterwards, I become cold, cynical, detached from the life and nature of my time. He was drinking too much, and all his immense powers seemed to have gone wasted. And he started working with you. And at them, as they worked, they noticed the singular negative synchronicities that had been in his life begin to vanish. Other physicists talked about the negative, the Pauli syndrome, because wherever he'd gone before, things happened to this opposite of this great man of power, which they called the Pauli syndrome. One occasion, he hardly arrived in the city when the town hall burst into flames. But you may see no connection, but it didn't happen only there, it happened all over the place. These negative synchronicities occurred, and they gradually, as he worked through his problem with you, these things vanished and totally disappeared. And at the end of some 3 or 4 years, he came out and to work creatively at his science. But this other exploration of this phenomenon, of these synchronicities, began to more and more deeply examine it. And he had a correspondence with Jung, which has just been published, only in German alas, of how they wrote. And he was pursuing the course he'd started, and Jung had been pursuing the course he'd started. And they gradually saw that the physics of the day was converging with the spirit of day. That the hypothesis of a collective unconscious, which explained all the most puzzling phenomena of the time, and in a sense completely overlaid, valid as he'd been provisionally, the sort of Newtonian world, was moving more and more in position, and in the world of physics, increasingly demonstrating its validity in terms of the physical world. And the deeper that they went into the atom, as it were, the deeper they went into the collective unconscious of matter, the more closer, became so close. It was a nonsense to talk about a gap between science and religion anymore. It was a nonsense, because au fond, at heart, they were the same. Now, that is one of the reasons why you've got to take the Skylark seriously. And I want to tell you how the synchronicities in connection with the environment has appeared again and again in my own life. Now I come back to your trust here. I stand again at the gate, which I was asked to open a while back, when we first stood on the edge of that field, which is so wonderfully in the process of refinding its own natural self. And don't forget that in finding its natural self, we are also finding a natural self that we have lost. And at the end, when I'd finished, there was a gentleman, I don't know if he's here today, but he'll remember, who'd been examining how the butterflies were coming back to that field. I think he said that since they'd started to rehabilitate the field, 30 new forms of butterfly had already come back. And that made me sit up, even in many ways, because the Greek word for the butterfly is the same word as soul. The soul was coming back to the field. The soul was coming back to the people who were doing it. There's a very old Chinese saying of a great Chinese sage who existed before the times of the Troubles, perhaps 4,000 or 5,000 words ago. When he saw the butterfly, said, "Is the butterfly something that I say I see, or am I something which the butterfly says it is seeing too?" And it seemed to be so important at the very beginning that this ancient correspondence between the manifestation of the butterfly and a dialogue with the soul showed itself. And I thought, well, if you are not all careful in this trust, you're going to be in the plight in which the character was in P.G. Woodhouse. Woodhouse had a character, went and stayed with his aunt in the country, and he wanted to write. And his aunt said, no, you must get out of the house, I'm spring cleaning. You must go and write in the garden. And he came back after a while to write again, and he said, the aunt said, but you can't go here, I've told you to write in the garden. He says, I can't write there, auntie. And she said, why not? He said, the butterflies are making such a hullabaloo. And I think you'll have such a hullabaloo that you may not hear yourself preaching in church. But it's coming back. It's coming back. There's the confirmation. And what I could tell you so many things, but bear in mind that this is what we have come to confirm. Is this frontier where we've said since the beginning of time, man has said, what is the difference between matter and the spirit? What is the frontier between matter and the spirit? Of course, there is the frontier. We mustn't talk to abolish frontiers. We must accept the existence of frontiers and limitations and horizons as indispensable, but provisional delineations to give things a specific meaning. But there is an intercommunication, vital to one and the other. There's an intercommunication which Pauli and Heisenberg were exploring, to the extent by which the observer changes the nature of what he observes. And the nature of what is observed changes the observer. There is this profound correspondence, and this is the correspondence to which we have to turn. Now, about 12 years ago, I was asked to open an enormous new park, a game park in South Africa, an enormous slice that was being added to the great national park of South Africa, one of the greatest in the world. It's about 300 miles from north to south and 120 miles from east to west, all given over to the natural world. And there was a great new slice added to it, and I was to open it. And at the same time I was opening it, which I'd done rather reluctantly, because there were books waiting for me to write of my own. And I said to myself, this is the last time that I ever do anything in public. And I had, on my way to open the park, they called me to the telephone. And there was a request on the telephone for me to do an important new discussion in public, which was very essential in South Africa. I didn't even wait to hear what it was. I said, I can't talk, ring me back this evening. But I said, obviously, I'll say no. Well, after the opening of this park, which is called after a great ranger who was a friend of mine, it's called Kirkman's today, I went very tired. I had a very, very difficult time for months. Then the rains had fallen that afternoon. It was a lovely evening, and I went with a ranger and myself in a jeep right off to be alone with the animals and with nature. And we went after a leopard, which we wanted to see and to follow. And we would have a lovely time, and the clouds had receded, and it was a wonderful fresh feeling in this great new park. And in the evening, we could stay too long, coming back in the twilight. We nearly ran into a shape which suddenly appeared in front of our jeep. And we braked, and the jeep stopped. And the giraffe, which was the shape, went off into the twilight. And as the jeep stopped, I heard the most wonderful sound. When I think of it, I feel quite sick with longing that I didn't have a tape with me. I could have recorded it, because I shall never hear anything so beautiful again. I heard the frogs. Wherever there was silence, there was a frog. These frogs, thousands and thousands of frogs, had been brought out by the rain to demonstrate what a great thing it was to be a frog. And they were singing. I heard 5 different voices. It was a great hallelujah chorus of frogs, and it made an incredible impression on me. And when I got back, the call came through again, would I speak in public? And they said that they wanted me to launch a memorial series of lectures about Smuts, a great South African and one of the greatest citizens of the post-war and pre-war world. A very, very great person. I'll tell you more about him now. And I thought, oh my God. I said, when do you want to know the answer? They said, oh, well, we need to know for 3 months. I said, that's fine. Talk to me again later in London. And I went back to London with this memory of the frogs singing and singing. And I was standing, waiting to start a new book. And I groped in my books and I pulled out Aristophanes' play on the frogs. And in this, I read it again, and I was amazed to find how dark the fate and the circumstances of Greece were at that moment. How hopeless, utterly hopeless it seemed. And Aristophanes wrote the frogs. And the theme of the frogs, roughly, simply is that the citizens of Athens had decided that only one thing would save them, is to get back the nowness of their history, to remind themselves of what sort of people they were. And they sent Dionysus to the underworld to bring a great spirit back from the underworld to speak to them. And this spirit, Dionysus, goes, and on the way to the underworld, the chorus is all, there's a chorus of frogs accompanying him, serenading, singing, we are the frogs of the marshes and the bogs, and we wish you well on the journey. All the way there are frogs. And then he arrives, and they have a great debate between the two chosen candidates. One side in Hades wants Euripides to go back, because he is by far the wittiest, the brightest, and at the same time, with the brightness, a profound playwright at the height of the Greek theatre before its decline. On the other hand, there was Aeschylus, somber, rather fateful, always writing as if fate was breathing down his neck, and he's rather heavy, and he's not trendy, he is just full of fate. And they think, well, perhaps he's too somber for us. But in the end, they choose Aeschylus. Why? Because he had fought also at Marathon. Euripides had not. So there it was, the complete picture. And I thought, my God, these frogs was telling me, you must summon a great spirit back to talk to your country. Your country's in a bad way. You've been asked to do that. You've got to bring Smuts back. There's no doubt that he's one of the greatest statesmen we ever had. And I decided then, and I wouldn't have done so without the frogs, without the environment, the mental things pressing on me. And in that connection, you'll see Smuts' importance. I said I would do the lecture. And when I did the lecture and talked about Smuts, first of all, they hired a smaller room for those kinds of lectures. Then they appealed to the university, who took a lecture room. The people, ultimately, they had to choose a theatre for 2,000 people it held, who wanted to hear this occasion organized by the frogs. And I talked to them for about 3 hours about the importance of this. And I said, I can't get to the end. I've told you enough. Now you must take it further. And I hope I have established for you the importance of the example that you set here. The reason Pauli went on exploring his own synchronicity, because as he wrote to you, he said, more and more I found that the synchronicity and the work I've done on myself, he said, I thought it was selfish, curing myself. I was doing for the cosmos and the universe. More and more did I realize its universal importance. So realize, all of us, we've got to fight our corners, and with the help of our little synchronicities, as we've never fought them before in life, because we've never has the planet been in so great a danger as it is now. Our time's running out. We've got to fight for time, and people won't listen. If I talk to people in London, I ring up people, I say to them, you know, we have had no proper rain. We've got a drought. The country's drying up, the parks are going black. And my friends in the office say, well, where are they? I have no time to see the parks these days. And I said, have you seen the country? Oh no, I haven't been to the country recently. I know that most people, there are millions of people living in towns in London for whom the weather is only one consideration, whether it's going to make their weekends nice or going to spoil them. They don't know anything about it, they're not interested. The weather, I watch it, I was brought up as a child, I watch it all day long. It's of the utmost importance to our lives. Nature is the utmost importance to our lives. I was taxi drivers in London. I found, thanks to the World About Us series on television, where they see nature, they go into nature, are converted. But he said, what can we do? I said, get a window box. Get a window box, make it your flag. Fly your flag under that and live under that. Now this brings me to Smuts. And why the Smuts thing was so important. Because Smuts was sent from a small Afrikaner household in South Africa to university and ultimately to Cambridge, where he took not one, but 2 double firsts at Cambridge. And at Cambridge, he came across the work of an American poet called Walt Whitman, which was denounced everywhere for he was over the top, he was thrown this and emotional that. He brought out his first book of poems called Leaves of Grass. And Smuts took it because grass was the great love of his life. From beginning to end, he loved grass and the plants and the world, particularly of Africa, as nothing else on the world. He was called upon from there to become a statesman and to become first a soldier that led the greatest guerrilla raid in the history of mankind, perhaps. Fought as a guerrilla commander of great genius. And when his men were plundering the military columns they'd ambushed, and they were looking for drink and cigarettes and tobacco and clothes, he was going through the baggage to see if he could find books to read. Because he only had one book in his own military saddlebag, and that was Leaves of Grass. He fought, then became one of the world's greatest statesmen, who wrote the first paper for the League of Nations, which had failed. Again said, we must try again. He wrote it for the second great paper, for the blueprint of the United Nations, which is failing us so shamefully and tragically at this moment. But he went on trying, and he went on sailing under the leaves of grass. And I guess he tried, and that was the talk which I gave. And all the people came. They came to hear me talk about Smuts and Leaves of Grass. And so, just to come back where we started, I was asked yesterday on an interview by the BBC, what's Christianity got to do with conservation? And I said, but the Christian story started in the garden, in the greatest garden there's ever been. Until through, I don't know, the symbolists, until they were thrown out because of the serpent and the tree of fruit and knowledge and Adam and Eve. And an angel with a flaming sword was mounted over the gate, and they had to go out in exile. And this is really the story of human life, because we're throwing out of the garden of ourselves, out of the gardens that we have in the world, we're being thrown out of them. But, again, to quote Eliot, he says, we shall not cease. He's quoting Our Lady of Norwich, so near to you here. Our Lady of Norwich, who said, we shall not cease from exploration, and all things, all manner of things shall be well. And Eliot adds, we shall explore until our searching brings to the place where we started from, and we shall recognize it as for the first time. And this is the object of life. We must go back to the place we started from, which is the garden, and to serve it and recognize it for the first time. And I would just like here to offer you something which is a character in one of my books. I won't tell you the name because I'm not here to peddle my goods. But the hunter is on his way out of a great conservation area he's created, an old white hunter who's repented and serving nature. And on his way out, it's a very dry time, he sees the clouds building up into a great cathedral presence in the sky. And he hears the thunder, and he smells the rain. And he gets off his horse and stands by his horse and smells the rain. And a great emotion goes over him. And he wants to pray. He feels, I've got to pray. But this is too much, I must pray. And he begins, Our Father, which art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. And then he can't go on. He has a feeling of sacrilege almost, because he feels there's something to be added to it. And with his upbringing, he thinks it's horrendous. What a presumption to add to the Lord's Prayer. But he's forced to, and he begins again. Our Father, which art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Our Mother, which art in earth, praised be thy name. Our Father in heaven and our Mother in earth, their will and their love shall be one. And that's where I'd like to leave it.
Tape end. Do you think it has? Or it's flashing tape end.